It was, he asserted, merely an aged fishing vessel. Move past it. The proprietor of the yacht chuckled as the sizable aperture devastated the elder seaman's craft. No assistance was rendered, no apologies were offered. The American flag, affixed to the sun-faded craft, floated into the harbor, rent. However, the subsequent morning, the whole harbor fell quiet as 6 naval vessels entered silently, their ensigns lowered to half-staff. Whom were they honoring, and for what reason had the ocean abruptly recalled a man overlooked? Thomas Reynolds, at 72 years of age, had resided a tranquil existence in Harborside for many decades. The majority of his mornings were spent on the water prior to sunrise, his time-worn hands steering the wooden craft he had meticulously constructed following his return from military duty. In a seaside town progressively controlled by opulence and tourism, he represented a living vestige, esteemed by a few, unnoticed by the majority. His craft, Liberty Child, was not particularly striking in appearance. Its paint had diminished under 4 decades of saline exposure and solar rays, and the wooden framework revealed its maturity with each complaining creak, yet it was robust. Fashioned by an individual who comprehended that comeliness frequently resides below the exterior, Thomas had assembled it piece by piece upon his return from Vietnam, employing the methodical labor to pacify the recollections that pursued him homeward from the ocean. The residents possessed scant knowledge of his military history. Thomas was not inclined to discuss such matters. They were aware only that he had served in the Navy and that, on occasion, he would awaken with cries in the darkness, sounds that traversed the water on tranquil nights when he slumbered on his vessel. That particular Wednesday morning commenced like all others. Thomas had departed at 5 a.m., intending to inspect his crab traps and observe the dawn from his preferred location near the harbor's entrance. He had just completed fastening his mooring lines when he detected the profound pulsation of potent engines. The La Vita rounded the harbor's curve, resembling a glistening white massif, 600 tons of opulent Italian engineering, cleaving the water with an air of assured prerogative. At the controls was Jackson Reed, a 38-year-old technology magnate who had not long ago acquired the town's most substantial seaside estate. Thomas identified him from the community newspapers, which had lauded his advent as a financial boon for the economically challenged locality. Thomas gestured with his arms, indicating his location. The yacht gave no indication of decelerating. "Hey, I'm moored here," he shouted, his voice drowned out by the yacht's engine sounds. On the superior deck, Reed and his companions lifted champagne glasses, chuckling at some personal jest, either unaware of or unconcerned about the diminutive wooden vessel in their course. The harbor patrol craft floated close by, its officer observing with unease but taking no action to step in. The collision occurred with a nauseating crush. Liberty Child's aft section fractured beneath the yacht's prow, the timber proving no contest for steel and fiberglass. Thomas scarcely succeeded in leaping to safety, impacting the dock forcefully as his boat, his handiwork, his refuge, disintegrated beneath the more substantial craft. The American flag he had displayed daily for 4 decades ripped away, tumbling into the agitated water, its crimson bands merging with the froth. The engines eventually ceased. In the abrupt quietude, Reed's irritated voice resonated distinctly across the water. "It's merely an aged fishing vessel. Move past it." Thomas rose unhurriedly, his arthritic joints complaining. A throng had assembled around him, morning runners, dock laborers, sightseers with their telephones elevated. Not a single individual moved to offer aid. The harbor security official came near hesitantly. "Mr. Reynolds, I will need to complete an incident report." But Thomas was not heeding him. He had caught sight of his flag floating away, tattered and soaked. He hobbled along the pier, pursuing it until he could extend his arm with a painful shoulder and retrieve it from the water. He pressed the saturated material to his chest, holding it as gently as he might have held a deceased compatriot. His eyes, when he lifted them to the onlookers, contained neither fury nor reproach, only a silent self-respect that caused the observers to look away with unease. "Pleasant vessel," Reed shouted from his deck, the derision slicing through the morning atmosphere. "Perhaps it's time for an improvement, old fellow. Everything has a point of obsolescence." Thomas uttered no response. He merely collected the drenched flag and departed, his posture erect despite the discomfort in his joints, his gait firm despite the tremor in his hands. Behind him, someone chuckled. A telephone alert sounded as the initial video appeared online under the heading, Elderly man, aged boat, stale information. By midday, the harbor had reverted to its usual state. The shattered remains of Liberty Child had been taken away, an unsightly object eliminated, an issue resolved. Individuals scrolled by the video, the majority halting only briefly enough to enter LOL before resuming their activities. No one alluded to the tears that had shimmered, unfallen, in an elderly sailor's eyes. Thomas's residence was situated on a minor promontory that commanded a view of the harbor, an unpretentious dwelling acquired with his Navy retirement funds many years prior, before real estate prices had escalated beyond the means of ordinary laborers. Through his primary window, he had observed the town's metamorphosis from a fishing enclave into a holiday locale, the alteration as incremental and unyielding as the ocean's ebb and flow. That evening, he was seated at his kitchen table, a wooden coffer open in front of him. Within lay the mementos of a lifetime dedicated to service, discolored photographs of youthful men with solemn expressions, letters of praise yellowed by time. Identification tags that had once rested against his chest during nocturnal vigils and tempestuous voyages. At the very base, meticulously folded, rested another American flag, this particular one immaculate and unblemished, bestowed upon him at the time of his retirement from active duty. His grandson Michael, on a visit from his university studies, stood at the entrance, observing. "You intend to take legal action against them, don't you, Grandpa? That individual demolished your boat. He ought to compensate." Thomas moved his head from side to side unhurriedly, his digits outlining the stitched stars on the ensign. "He did not strike me," he stated softly. "He merely struck something for which no one ever felt concern." Michael furrowed his brow, the unfairness igniting more intensely in his youthful spirit than in his grandfather's experienced one. "But you constructed that boat. It held significance for you." "Indeed," Thomas concurred, "to me." Subsequently, after Michael had retired for the night, Thomas accessed his old ship's journal. For 4 decades, he had documented meteorological conditions, the ocean's state, and the day's haul. Now he inscribed merely initial day devoid of Liberty Child. No expressions of sympathy received. Yet I can still perceive the water summons. He shut the journal and activated his compact television. The local news broadcast featured a segment about Reed's yacht, commemorating it as the most substantial private craft ever to moor in Harborside Harbor. There was no reference to the morning's incident. On the internet, the video had achieved widespread circulation. The majority of remarks favored the yacht's proprietor, that aged boat was unsightly regardless. These individuals of the older generation must recognize when to step down. Why not simply adapt to contemporary times and acquire a modern vessel? The harbor official had telephoned that afternoon, his tone professionally detached as he clarified, "Your craft was not outfitted with radar detection devices or appropriate navigational illuminations. It did not meet prevailing regulations. I regret to inform you the insurance provider will not indemnify the damage." Thomas had listened without speaking, then expressed gratitude to the man and ended the call. He had not deemed it necessary to state that his boat had been exempted under prior rules or that he had never failed a safety examination in 4 decades. What purpose would it serve? Liberty Child had vanished. The ocean had reclaimed what he had temporarily taken from it. Such was the way of existence. Nevertheless, as he stood on his veranda that evening, gazing out at the harbor's illuminations, the void pained him like a missing extremity. It was not merely timber and fabric he had forfeited. It was the tranquil mornings spent observing dolphins frolic in his vessel's trail, the serene evenings when the craft's gentle motion had calmed his disturbed slumbers. It was the singular location where the conflict could not pursue him, where the ocean's cadence supplanted the recollections of ordnance and cries. From his observation point, he could discern La Vida illuminated like a buoyant metropolis, melodies and merriment wafting across the water. Life proceeded without interruption, the affluent and unburdened commemorating their prosperity while an elderly man grieved in solitude. Thomas did not envy their felicity, he had witnessed sufficient anguish to span numerous existences. He merely desired that they comprehended what had been forfeited, not solely a boat, but a linkage to something more profound, a manner of existing in the world that prized quietude and seclusion, that revered the sea rather than subjugating it. Under the moonlight, he unfurled his retired service ensign and arranged it over the veranda railing, permitting the oceanic zephyr to stroke the material anew. At daybreak, he arose from custom, reaching for his boat's keys before recalling. The empty sensation in his chest swelled until it appeared to occupy the entire chamber. For the initial occasion in 4 decades, he had no destination when the early light diminished. The morning mist lay densely over Harbor's side, enveloping the harbor entrance in an opalescent vapor. Thomas was seated on his porch, his coffee growing cold in his grasp, observing the spectral veil that divided terra firma from the ocean. Since the forfeiture of Liberty Child, he had found himself adhering to his usual schedule but lacking a destination, a mariner marooned on solid ground. The initial sign that something out of the ordinary was occurring manifested when the harbor's fog signal emitted 3 prolonged blasts, which resonated through the morning's quiet. Thomas sat up, his ingrained senses identifying the call for substantial craft entering the port. Through the vapor, somber forms materialized, immense and deliberate, cleaving the water with methodical exactitude. 6 Navy vessels arrayed in formation, their silhouettes becoming more defined as they drew nearer. No prior declarations had heralded their coming, no festivity had been arranged. Most notable of all was the quietude, no audible signals, no communications beyond the essential navigational protocols. On every craft, the American flag was displayed at half-staff, a demonstration of sorrow and esteem. As information disseminated, the town's inhabitants congregated along the shoreline. Proprietors turned their business signs to closed and hastened to the piers. Youngsters were dismissed prematurely from summer activities, their animated chatter subdued by guardians who perceived the gravity of the occasion without comprehending its origin. From his observation point, Thomas observed with bewilderment. No naval maneuvers had been slated, no important personages were expected. There was no justification for this exhibition of armed forces in the modest tourist haven. The foremost vessel, a guided missile destroyer, moored with exactitude. On its deck stood Rear Admiral James Nelson, his formal white uniform pristine, his expression set in conventional lines. In his gloved grasp, he held a faultlessly folded American flag, the triangle of azure and stars exhibited with ritualistic attention. Thomas experienced an unfamiliar constriction in his chest. He recognized that particular fold, he had executed it himself on numerous occasions throughout his years of service. It was the fold reserved for honoring those who had perished, for acknowledging selfless acts. Unhurriedly, acutely conscious of his rigid joints in his non-military attire, Thomas proceeded towards the harbor. The assembly made way for him, unaware of the reason, yet perceiving an element of significance in his measured advance toward the congregated naval personnel. Admiral Nelson noticed him and advanced, his salute sharp and conventional. "Chief Petty Officer Reynolds," he declared, his voice resonating across the abruptly stilled harbor. Requesting authorization to disembark and bestow honors. Thomas reciprocated the salute instinctively, the movement ingrained in his muscle memory despite the intervening decades of civilian existence. "Authorization granted, Admiral," he responded, his voice more firm than he had anticipated. The Admiral came down the boarding ramp, succeeded by a ceremonial color guard. The congregated sailors on all 6 vessels stood rigidly, oriented towards the land. 43 years prior, Nelson commenced, speaking to the assembled onlookers rather than to Thomas directly. This individual averted a disastrous malfunction on board the USS Constellation when a refrigeration unit breached amidst a tempest in the South China Sea. He personally secured the enclosure, suffering grave burns over 60% of his person. His deeds precluded poisonous fumes from infiltrating the berthing areas where 128 sailors rested, oblivious to the peril. A susurrus rippled through the assembly. Many pivoted to observe Thomas with altered perception, noticing for the initial occasion the subtle cicatrices that marked his neck and vanished below his collar. Chief Reynolds never discussed his deeds. He refused the Navy Cross, requesting merely that we look after the young men who did not return. He has resided in your midst for 4 decades, soliciting nothing, anticipating nothing. The Admiral's attention surveyed the harbor, pausing momentarily on the lustrous yacht where Reed and several companions stood observing. The previous day, his craft, Liberty Child, was demolished in this very harbor. No aid was provided. No deference was demonstrated. The ensign under which he served was permitted to submerge. A youthful sailor advanced, bearing a wooden tablet. He neared Thomas and inclined his head in respect before offering it. Thomas gazed down at the burnished plane. It held a brass plate originating from a retired vessel, inscribed with the legend, "For the individual who maintained maritime safety, even subsequent to his service. The United States Navy does not forsake its members." Admiral Nelson proceeded. "We have arrived to bestow honors upon Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds and to recognize that his dedication did not cease upon the removal of his uniform." Throughout the harbor, sailors stood rigidly, saluting. The color guard elevated their ensigns. In that instant, it was not merely 6 vessels that had docked. It was the entire gravitas of naval heritage and comradeship. An individual in the crowd commenced a live broadcast of the ceremony. Within moments, the recording was proliferating across social media networks. The hashtag #BoomerDown, which had been associated with the previous day's video of the boat incident, swiftly yielded to #VeteranSalute. Commentators who had ridiculed the elderly man only hours earlier now hastened to erase their remarks, which were supplanted by expressions of esteem and contrition. I was entirely unaware. Why did no one inform us he was a hero? This exemplifies genuine service. Reed, observing from his yacht, possessed the decency to appear discomfited. His companions had become quiet, their champagne glasses put aside as the ceremony progressed. Following the official presentation, Admiral Nelson conversed privately with Thomas. "We learned of the incident from your grandson, Michael. He reached out to the Navy Alumni Association. Why did you not contact us directly, Chief?" Thomas gestured non-committally with his shoulders. "Not your concern, sir. It was merely a boat." "No, Reynolds. It was never merely a boat. And you were never merely a sailor." The Admiral gazed out over the expanse of water. "Certain obligations can never be fully settled." As the ceremony drew to a close and the assemblages started to scatter, a peculiar event transpired. Individually, town residents approached Thomas, many for the initial occasion in years, and extended their hands, their gratitude, their expressions of regret. The harbor official bestowed upon him angling licenses valid for his lifetime. The proprietor of the local boat basin tendered him a mooring without cost for any craft he might select. Thomas received all of this with the same silent self-respect he had exhibited when his boat was demolished. Yet, to those who observed attentively, a novel illumination was present in his eyes, not exultation but acknowledgement. After decades of quietude, he had been perceived. A week thereafter, a modest commemorative event took place at Thomas's customary mooring location. A straightforward stone monument now occupied the pier, Liberty Child, a vessel that bore more than a single existence. The town council had sanctioned it without dissent, with a number of councilors tearfully admitting they had never been aware of the genuine narrative of the reserved man who had resided in their midst for many years. The harbor had transformed in understated yet meaningful manners. Where sightseers had previously walked past Thomas without a look, they now halted at the monument, perusing the tablet that succinctly detailed his military history. Local anglers who had been incrementally relegated to the periphery by leisure boats discovered they were now met with renewed esteem. Most astonishing was the alteration in the youngsters. Where they had formerly been distanced from the elderly fishermen, regarded as inconsequential remnants of a past age, they now congregated at the piers following school, keen to listen to tales and acquire abilities that no digital application could impart. On this specific afternoon, Thomas was seated on a recently placed bench oriented towards his former mooring site, illustrating knot-tying methods to a gathering of absorbed children. His knotted digits moved with unexpected adroitness, converting plain cordage into elaborate configurations that had anchored craft through innumerable tempests. "This particular one is known as a bowline," he clarified, his tone gentle. "It has been safeguarding mariners since prior to Columbus." A young female child named Lily, approximately 7 years of age, observed with earnest focus as he directed her hands through the maneuvers. Are you resentful towards the individual who damaged your boat? She inquired abruptly with the forthright inquisitiveness only children possess. Thomas paused, contemplating her query with the same meticulousness he had applied to instructing her in the knot. No, he stated at last. Were it not for them, perhaps no one would recall that boat's existence. The children assimilated this with grave inclinations of their heads, comprehending intuitively a sagacity that numerous adults had failed to perceive. Later that same afternoon, Thomas had an unforeseen caller. Jackson Reed stood uncertainly at the pier's margin, his high-fashion sunglasses resting atop his head, appearing noticeably ill at ease without his customary retinue. "Mr. Reynolds," he commenced, then halted, palpably contending with unaccustomed circumstances. "I arrived to offer my apologies. My conduct was indefensible." Thomas inclined his head but remained silent, expectant. Reed presented an envelope. "I wish to rectify this. Contained herein is an open check. Whatever you deem equitable recompense for your vessel and for my actions, simply state the sum." Thomas regarded the envelope but did not move to accept it. "Monetary funds will not reconstruct what has been forfeited," he stated softly. "Then inform me what will suffice," Reed responded, and for the initial occasion, authentic sentiment penetrated his cultivated charm. "I have behaved like an utter fool, and now I am ubiquitous on the internet as the individual who demolished a hero's boat. Just instruct me on how to amend this." Thomas contemplated the younger individual for a protracted instant. "There is a location on the eastern jetty," he said at length. "It is oriented towards the sunrise. Place a bench there, a well-made, durable one. Have it inscribed with 3 words. Sit, remember, thank." Reed blinked, evidently anticipating a more considerable demand. "Is that all?" "Merely a bench." "At times," Thomas remarked, gazing out over the water. "What individuals require most is a location to pause and recollect what is significant." 2 days subsequently, a master craftsman in wood from Seattle came to set up a hand-sculpted teak bench at the exact spot Thomas had designated. The 3 words were embedded in bronze, destined to acquire a patina from the marine atmosphere but never to vanish completely. Reed personally assisted with the installation, laboring without objection despite the sores developing on his well-kept hands. News of Thomas's reply to Reed's proposition circulated through the town and further afield. The narrative was reported by national news outlets. "Veteran forgoes wealth, solicits memorial bench instead." Pundits discussed whether he had been excessively lenient or deeply sagacious. Veterans organizations referenced his case when deliberating the authentic significance of service and selflessness. Thomas himself sidestepped the reinvigorated focus. He persisted with his tranquil daily round, now revolving around instruction rather than angling. Without Liberty Child, he was no longer able to supply fish for the local soup kitchen, as he had done for many years, but he discovered he could contribute something of comparable worth. Time, forbearance, and the sagacity derived from an existence lived in proximity to nature. A month subsequent to the event, Admiral Nelson came back, on this occasion without ceremony, operating a civilian vehicle and dressed in informal attire. He located Thomas at his customary place on the pier. "The Secretary of the Navy has a proposal for you," Nelson stated after they had exchanged salutations. "There is a youth nautical initiative. They are seeking to grow, imparting skills in seamanship, navigation, and environmental responsibility. They require educators who comprehend both the ocean and young individuals." Thomas arched an eyebrow. "I am an elderly man, Admiral, not of great utility to anyone presently." Nelson chuckled. "Communicate that to the youngsters who trailed you like small waterfowl when I arrived. The role is available to you if you desire it. Part-time, adaptable schedule, respectable remuneration." Before Thomas being able to reply, a disturbance at the harbor's ingress captured their notice. A diminutive wooden craft was being brought in by tow, recently constructed yet possessing a clearly conventional aesthetic. On its aft section, newly applied paint shone, "Liberty's Child." The whole town appeared to have congregated on the piers. Michael was positioned at the tiller, smiling broadly. "Surprise, Grandpa," he called out. "We all contributed." The design is derived from your original schematics. I discovered them in your storage building. The Boat Builders Association provided the raw materials, and veterans from 4 different states arrived to assist with the building process. Thomas remained without words, his time-worn countenance contorting with feeling as the craft, so strikingly similar to his forfeited boat, neared the pier. It is not precisely identical, Michael conceded as he fastened the mooring ropes. We incorporated some contemporary safety elements, and the navigational apparatus is modernized. However, the essence remains unchanged. Your hands may not have constructed it, but your spirit conceived it. As Thomas set foot on board, his feet regaining their equilibrium on the softly swaying deck with the ingrained sense of a lifetime spent at sea, he passed his hand along the burnished wooden railing. At the prow, a new American flag flapped sharply in the wind. For an individual who maintained belief, Michael stated softly, even when it appeared no one was observing. That evening, as the setting sun suffused the harbor with hues of gold and deep red, Thomas was seated on Reed's bench, observing the fishing vessels coming back with their day's harvest. A youthful pair stopped close by, perusing the 3 words incised into the timber. Their offspring inquired as to their significance. It signifies, the father clarified, that we ought to pause intermittently and reflect upon the individuals who rendered our existences feasible. Thomas smiled faintly, his attention fixed on the distant line where the ocean converged with the heavens in an unbroken fusion of azure. In a world perpetually advancing, he had transformed into a living memento to glance rearward, not with wistfulness, but with reverence for the underpinnings upon which the current era is constructed. His new craft would navigate the identical waters as its predecessor, perpetuating the same principles: composure amidst tempests, aid willingly offered, silent valor when necessitated. He did not demand retribution, he simply retrieved the rent ensign and departed. Yet, the subsequent morning, the ocean recalled him.